The moment someone decides who you are before asking your name, the truth stops mattering, at least for a while. That thought stayed with me long after the afternoon everything changed, although when I woke up that morning, I believed my biggest concern would be whether our robotics team could impress the scholarship judges. My name is Malik Tully. I was 17 years old, a high school senior in suburban Virginia, and I had spent nearly every afternoon for the past 8 months inside our engineering lab building a competition robot with 3 classmates who had become more like family than teammates. Winning the regional championship would not magically solve every problem in my life, but it could open doors I had spent years trying to reach. My mother always reminded me that opportunities rarely arrived by accident. She believed preparation created its own luck, and I had grown up believing her. By 2:30 that afternoon, our presentation was finally over. The judges congratulated every team, though they revealed no winners yet. I packed our control modules, design notebook, spare sensors, and programming laptop into the hard gray equipment case our school issued for competitions. My teammates stayed behind to take pictures with the trophy display while I volunteered to carry everything back to Coach Ortiz's pickup truck parked along the visitor lot outside the athletic fields. The August heat still hung in the air even though classes had already started again, and students filled the sidewalks discussing football practice, homework, and weekend plans. Parents slowly filtered through the parking lots, waiting for their teenagers to finish club activities. It felt like one of those completely ordinary school afternoons that disappear from memory almost as soon as they happen. I smiled when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mom asking, "How did it go?" I answered, "Presentation went great. I'll tell you everything tonight." She replied with a thumbs-up emoji and one sentence she had written to me hundreds of times before. "Proud of you no matter what." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, adjusted the equipment case in one hand, and started walking across the front entrance circle toward the visitor parking lot beside the athletic fields. Before I reached the crosswalk, a police cruiser rolled slowly past me. I barely noticed it at first. Police officers visited campus fairly often because our school resource officer coordinated with the local department during larger events. Nothing about seeing a patrol car seemed unusual. The cruiser continued another 20 feet before stopping. A second patrol vehicle pulled in behind it. Both drivers' doors opened almost simultaneously. 2 white officers stepped out. The taller one had a muscular build, neatly pressed uniform, and dark hair combed straight back in a polished, slicked-back style that looked almost too perfect despite the humidity. His nameplate read Terry Simmons. Beside him was Officer Rodney Pender, slightly younger, quieter, and noticeably less aggressive in the way he scanned the area. Simmons looked directly at me before speaking. "You there. Stop for a minute." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the unmistakable expectation that nobody would question it. I stopped immediately. "Yes, sir," I answered. Simmons glanced from me to the equipment case. "Set that down." I carefully lowered the case onto the sidewalk. Students walking nearby slowed down without stopping completely. A few parents looked over from their vehicles, sensing something unusual was unfolding. "What's inside?" Simmons asked. "Our robotics equipment," I replied. "We just finished the regional competition." "Open it." "Sure," I said calmly. The coach has the combination written inside the folder because multiple students used the case. I reached slowly toward my backpack for the paperwork. "Don't reach yet," Simmons interrupted sharply. I froze exactly where I was. Pender watched silently, his eyes shifting between me and the growing number of people beginning to notice the conversation. "Can I explain?" I asked. "You can answer questions," Simmons replied. "That's what you can do." My heartbeat picked up, not because I thought I had done anything wrong, but because I suddenly realized this conversation wasn't following the path I expected. 2 girls from my calculus class whispered to each other while standing near the entrance doors. Someone farther back quietly lifted a phone. Coach Ortiz had not come outside yet. The assistant principal was still inside the auditorium announcing awards. For reasons I couldn't explain, the space around us felt strangely smaller with every passing second. Then Simmons reached toward my backpack without another word, and somewhere behind the gathering crowd, an unfamiliar voice quietly said, Officer, before you go any further, you may want to ask the school to contact his parent. He is still a minor. Every conversation around us seemed to pause after that unexpected comment. Officer Simmons turned toward the voice, but the man who had spoken did not sound frightened or confrontational. He was simply one of the volunteer judges from the robotics competition, wearing his event badge around his neck and holding a clipboard. Emergency contact? Simmons asked. Why would that matter? The volunteer answered carefully. Because he is 17 years old, and if he is being detained on school property, the administration should notify his parent immediately. I am not suggesting special treatment. I am suggesting that the school follow its normal procedure. Simmons barely acknowledged him before turning back toward me. We are not discussing your parents right now. I nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. Open your backpack slowly. I will. I unzipped the front compartment exactly as instructed and removed the laminated competition folder with 2 fingers so every movement remained visible. Pender accepted it while Simmons continued watching me instead of the documents. Pender flipped through the pages. His expression changed almost immediately. Terry, he said quietly, this looks like official school competition paperwork. Simmons extended his hand without taking his eyes off me. Pender passed him the folder. Simmons glanced at the cover for only a second before closing it again. Paperwork does not prove anything, he said. People carry fake documents all the time. I wanted to respond, but years of listening to my mother had taught me something important. Never argue with someone who has already decided not to hear you. Instead, I answered each question directly and kept my voice calm. Around us, more students gathered near the entrance steps. Several teachers walked outside after noticing the growing crowd. My robotics teammate Luis pushed through the group. Malik, he called. Coach has been looking for you. Simmons raised one hand toward him. Stay back. Luis stopped immediately. Officer, that is our equipment case, he explained. The whole team packed it together. Simmons ignored him. Instead, he motioned toward the gray case. Open it. I knelt beside the case without making any sudden movement and entered the combination that Coach Ortiz had taped inside the folder. The latches clicked open. Simmons lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized wiring harnesses, aluminum brackets, battery packs, safety goggles, engineering notebooks filled with handwritten calculations, and the control system our team had spent months designing. Pender carefully picked up one notebook. Across the front, written in thick black marker, were the words Jefferson Regional Robotics Championship. His eyes moved toward me for the first time with something that looked less like suspicion and more like uncertainty. Before anyone could speak, Coach Ortiz hurried across the parking lot, slightly out of breath. Officers, he said, that equipment belongs to the school. Malik is one of my students. Simmons remained unmoved. We received a report about suspicious behavior. I would later learn that the caller had described a young black male carrying a locked equipment case near parked vehicles and suggested that he might be attempting to steal something, even though no theft, damaged property, or missing equipment had actually been reported. Coach Ortiz answered, carrying robotics equipment after a robotics competition is not suspicious behavior. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Even the students recording on their phones seemed to recognize that the explanation was obvious. Then Simmons asked a question that surprised everyone. Can you prove these documents belong to him? Coach Ortiz blinked. The scholarship invitation inside that folder has his full name on it. Pender reopened the folder, found the letter, and quietly read the first line. His shoulders stiffened. Standing a few yards away, Assistant Principal Linda Chavez had finally arrived. She listened for less than 30 seconds before taking out her phone and stepping aside. She spoke softly enough that I could not hear the entire conversation, but I distinctly heard 4 words before she looked back toward us with an expression I had never seen before. She is on her way. Assistant Principal Linda Chavez slipped her phone back into her pocket without offering any explanation, but the look on her face was enough to make several teachers exchange uneasy glances. She walked toward Officer Simmons with the calm confidence of someone trying to prevent a situation from getting worse instead of trying to win an argument. Officer, she said politely. Malik is one of our highest performing students. He has never had a disciplinary referral, and every adult standing here can confirm he was inside the robotics competition until just a few minutes ago. Simmons nodded once but did not soften his expression. Ma'am, we received a report that we are obligated to investigate. And you absolutely should investigate, Ms. Chavez replied. We are simply asking that the investigation be based on facts that are already available. She pointed toward the entrance of the science building. Our security cameras cover the competition hallway, the lobby, and the walkway leading to this parking lot. They will show exactly where Malik has been all afternoon. Simmons looked briefly toward the building before returning his attention to me. Video does not tell us everything. Around us, the crowd continued growing. Parents who had come to pick up their children stepped closer while maintaining a respectful distance. Several students quietly lowered their phones after teachers reminded them not to interfere, but others continued recording from the sidewalk. The atmosphere remained surprisingly quiet. Nobody shouted. Nobody pushed forward. The silence somehow made everything feel heavier. Coach Ortiz folded his arms. Officer Pender already saw the scholarship letter and the engineering notebook. The equipment belongs to the school. What exactly are you still looking for? Pender hesitated before answering. We are verifying the original complaint. His voice sounded professional, but it lacked the certainty it had carried only minutes earlier. Then something unexpected happened. One of the parents near the front of the crowd raised her hand slightly as though she were in a classroom. Excuse me, she called. I was parked over there waiting for my daughter. I watched this young man walk out of the building carrying that case. He did not speak to anyone. He did not run. He did not approach any vehicles. Another parent immediately nodded. I saw the same thing. A third added, so did I. The comments were calm, factual, and remarkably consistent. Nobody was trying to inflame the situation. They were simply describing what they had witnessed. For the first time, Pender turned toward the growing group instead of looking only at Simmons. A faint crease formed across his forehead. It was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile the original report with what dozens of independent witnesses were describing. Before anyone could continue, another teacher hurried outside carrying a tablet. Linda, she said quietly to the assistant principal. I already checked the hallway cameras. Ms. Chavez glanced at the screen for only a moment. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly before she locked the display and held it against her side. She did not reveal what she had seen. Instead, she looked directly at Simmons. Officer, I strongly recommend that you review this recording before making any further decisions. Simmons remained silent. The pause stretched several long seconds. I finally spoke, keeping my voice as steady as I could. May I ask one question? Simmons looked at me. Go ahead. I swallowed once before asking the question that had been echoing through my mind since the patrol cars stopped. If I had walked out of that building looking different, carrying the same case with the same paperwork, would we still be standing here? Nobody answered. Not Simmons. Not Pender. Not anyone in the crowd. The only sound was the distant whistle from the athletic field where soccer practice had just begun. The silence itself became an answer that everyone interpreted differently. Then several people turned toward the main entrance as the low hum of approaching engines drifted across the parking lot. A dark sport utility vehicle rolled through the front gate without emergency lights and came to a quiet stop near the curb. Every conversation stopped as the vehicle came to a smooth stop near the curb, and even Officer Simmons seemed unsure why it had arrived. The sport utility vehicle came to a quiet stop without sirens, flashing lights, or any display meant to draw attention. Their arrival felt strangely understated, yet every person in the parking lot instinctively watched them. Even the conversations among students faded into silence. The driver's door opened, and a black woman stepped out wearing a navy business suit instead of a law enforcement uniform. She appeared to be in her early 40s, carrying only a leather portfolio and a calm expression that never suggested panic or anger. She walked at an unhurried pace, neither rushing nor hesitating, as though she had already decided exactly what she intended to do before she arrived. I recognized her immediately. It was my mother, Yolanda Tully. She looked at me first, quickly checking that I appeared unharmed, then shifted her attention toward the officers. "Good afternoon," she said evenly. "I am Yolanda Tully. I understand my son has been involved in an incident." Simmons studied her for a moment. "Ma'am, we are conducting an investigation." "I understand," she replied. "Before we continue, may I ask whether my son is free to leave, or is he being detained?" Simmons paused for only a second. "We are still determining that." My mother nodded once. "Then I would appreciate knowing the legal basis for extending this encounter." Her tone remained respectful, almost conversational. There was no accusation in her voice, only carefully chosen questions. Pender quietly glanced toward Simmons, waiting for him to respond. Instead, Simmons answered with another question. "Are you an attorney?" My mother gave a small smile. "No, she did not." "Elaborate." Coach Ortiz stepped beside Assistant Principal Chavez and whispered something that I could not hear. Several parents exchanged puzzled looks. They had expected an emotional confrontation from a worried parent. Instead, they were watching someone who seemed remarkably composed despite finding her teenage son surrounded by officers in front of his school. Simmons folded his arms. "We received a complaint that required investigation." "That is entirely appropriate," my mother answered. "Every legitimate complaint deserves to be examined carefully. My only concern is ensuring that every fact collected today is preserved accurately." She slowly opened her portfolio and removed a small notepad. "Would you please confirm that your body cameras are recording?" Simmons answered immediately. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, making a brief note. "I would also respectfully request that the school security footage and dispatch communications related to today's call be preserved according to normal procedure." Several people in the crowd looked at one another. Her request sounded unusually specific, yet entirely reasonable. Pender shifted his weight slightly before speaking for the first time since she arrived. "Those requests can certainly be documented." My mother thanked him politely. Then she looked back at Simmons. "Officer, could you also tell me whether my son has been accused of committing a specific crime?" Simmons hesitated. It was only a moment, but everyone nearby noticed it. Before he could answer, Assistant Principal Chavez quietly added, "Our security footage is already being secured." My mother acknowledged her with a grateful nod. The brief exchange changed the atmosphere in a subtle but unmistakable way. The conversation no longer centered on assumptions. It had begun revolving around documentation, timelines, and evidence. Simmons seemed to recognize the shift. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you appear unusually familiar with investigative procedure." My mother closed her portfolio and finally answered the question she had avoided since arriving. "That is because investigative procedure has been my profession for many years." She reached into her jacket, removed a credential wallet, and held it where both officers could read it without stepping closer. "My name is Yolanda Tully. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I am also Malik's mother." An almost complete silence settled over the parking lot. Pender looked from the credential to Simmons without saying a word. Several students lowered their phones in disbelief. Even Coach Ortiz seemed momentarily speechless. Simmons studied the identification for several long seconds before lifting his eyes again, and for the first time since the encounter began, he appeared uncertain about what to say next. For several seconds, nobody moved. The only sound came from the distant hum of traffic beyond the school entrance and the faint whistle of a soccer coach across the athletic fields. Officer Simmons slowly looked away from the credential and met my mother's eyes again. She had not raised her voice. She had not threatened anyone. She had simply identified herself. "Special Agent Tully," Simmons said carefully. "I understand your concern." "Thank you, officer," my mother replied. "I appreciate your professionalism. I also want to make one point absolutely clear before we continue." Simmons gave a slight nod. "I am here as Malik's mother. I am not here to supervise your investigation or interfere with your department. Your agency has its responsibilities, and mine has different ones. Several people in the crowd seemed surprised by that answer. A few had clearly expected her to use her position to take control of the situation. Instead, she continued in the same calm tone. My only request is that every piece of evidence related to today's encounter is preserved exactly as it exists. That protects my son, it protects the witnesses, and it protects your officers as well. Pender quietly exhaled, almost as though he had been waiting to hear someone say those words. Simmons remained composed, although the confidence he had displayed earlier had noticeably faded. My mother continued, I would like confirmation that the body camera recordings, dispatch audio, vehicle location records, and school surveillance footage are all retained under your department's normal evidence procedures. Pender answered before Simmons could respond. Those materials are routinely preserved whenever an incident requires review. Thank you, my mother replied. Please note that I am requesting preservation, not special access. Assistant Principal Chavez stepped forward holding the tablet that contained the hallway security footage. Officer Simmons, she said, our technology department has already secured copies of today's recordings, so nothing is accidentally overwritten. Simmons looked toward the tablet but did not ask to review it immediately. Instead, he glanced around the parking lot. Nearly everyone present had remained where they were, quietly observing. Parents stood beside their vehicles. Teachers stayed near the entrance. Students whispered among themselves but avoided interfering. It had become impossible to ignore that dozens of independent witnesses had seen nearly every moment of the encounter. Then Pender spoke in a lower voice that only those closest could hear. Terry, maybe it would be best if we document everything now before this gets any more complicated. Simmons did not answer immediately. His attention lingered on the growing line of witnesses. For the first time since the patrol cars had stopped me, he appeared to be considering how the situation looked from perspectives other than his own. Before anyone else could speak, a police sport utility vehicle entered the campus from the opposite side of the parking lot. Unlike the earlier arrivals, this vehicle displayed the markings of the local department. It parked behind the patrol cars, and a uniformed police lieutenant stepped out carrying a department tablet. Simmons and Pender straightened their posture as he approached. Without greeting anyone first, the lieutenant accepted a brief summary from Pender while Simmons stood silently beside him. The lieutenant listened without interruption, then looked toward Assistant Principal Chavez. Do you have access to the security recording? Yes, she answered. It is ready whenever you need it. The lieutenant nodded. Good. I would also like copies of every witness who voluntarily wishes to provide a statement. My mother said nothing. She simply stepped back beside me, placing one reassuring hand lightly on my shoulder without interrupting the process. That simple gesture reminded me that, despite everything happening around us, she had come first as my mother. The lieutenant finally turned toward Simmons. Before I review the video, he said evenly, there is one question I need answered first. Simmons looked directly at him. The lieutenant held up his tablet, where a notification had just appeared from department records, and quietly added, why does this incident already appear to match concerns that were documented months before today? The lieutenant did not raise his voice after asking the question. In fact, his calm tone made the silence that followed even more uncomfortable. Officer Simmons looked briefly at the tablet, then back at the lieutenant. Sir, I would prefer to submit a complete report before discussing previous records. The lieutenant nodded. You will have every opportunity to do that. He turned to Pender. Officer Pender, please begin documenting everyone who is willing to provide a voluntary witness statement. Yes, Lieutenant, Pender answered immediately. Several parents stepped forward one at a time, offering only factual descriptions of what they had personally observed. One explained that she had watched me walk directly from the school entrance carrying the gray equipment case. Another confirmed that she never saw me approach any vehicles or behave suspiciously. Coach Ortiz identified the robotics equipment and scholarship documents once again, while Assistant Principal Chavez confirmed that the school security recordings showed my movements throughout the afternoon. Nobody exaggerated. Nobody attempted to argue. Every statement simply added another piece to the same timeline. The lieutenant listened carefully before asking Assistant Principal Chavez if he could review the security footage inside the administration building. She agreed and invited him, Simmons, Pender, and a school technology specialist into the office. Before they walked away, my mother quietly said, "Lieutenant, thank you for preserving the process." He gave a respectful nod. Everyone deserves a fair review. As they disappeared through the front entrance, the crowd remained outside. The atmosphere felt different now. Earlier, people had watched with uncertainty. Now they waited for answers. My mother and I sat together on a nearby bench outside the office. She never asked me to describe what had happened because she knew there would be time for that later. Instead, she asked one simple question. "Are you all right?" I answered honestly, "I am now." She smiled gently. "Good. Remember something, Malik. The goal is never to win an argument. The goal is to let the facts stand on their own." About 20 minutes passed before the office door opened again. Pender emerged first, followed by the lieutenant. Simmons remained inside speaking with another supervisor who had quietly arrived during the review. Pender walked toward us but stopped several feet away. "Mrs. Tully," he said respectfully, "I wanted you to know that the security footage confirmed your son's timeline exactly as described." My mother thanked him without any sign of triumph. "I appreciate you letting us know." Pender hesitated before continuing. "There is something else." He lowered his voice. The lieutenant asked our records division to review previous citizen complaints involving similar encounters handled by Officer Simmons. My mother remained silent, allowing him to continue. "At this point, nobody has reached any conclusions. They are simply comparing documentation." She nodded. "That is exactly how it should be done." Pender looked relieved by her response. He had probably expected anger or demands for immediate punishment. Instead, he found someone insisting on the same careful process that investigators rely upon every day. A few minutes later, the lieutenant stepped outside carrying the department tablet. He addressed the waiting parents and teachers briefly, thanking them for remaining cooperative and explaining that the incident would receive a formal administrative review according to department policy. Then he looked toward Simmons, who had just exited the building. Simmons appeared noticeably quieter than before. The certainty that had defined him at the beginning of the afternoon had been replaced by something closer to reflection. Before anyone could leave, another notification appeared on the lieutenant's tablet. He stopped walking and read it twice. His expression changed almost immediately. He turned toward Simmons and said, "Records just confirmed something we did not expect. Several months ago, someone recommended that you attend an early intervention and bias awareness program, but that recommendation was never acted upon. I need to know exactly why that never happened." The question about the unfinished recommendation stayed with everyone long after the school parking lot had begun to empty. By early evening, parents had picked up their children, teachers had returned to their classrooms, and the patrol vehicles were gone. My mother and I drove home quietly, not because there was nothing to say, but because we both understood that the story had moved beyond a single afternoon. The following morning, our local police department released a brief public statement confirming that the encounter was under administrative review and that all available evidence, including body camera recordings, school security footage, witness statements, and dispatch records, had been secured. They emphasized that no conclusions had yet been reached. My mother read the statement from her phone over breakfast and simply said, "That is how responsible investigations begin." When I returned to school later that day, students greeted me differently than they had before. Some offered encouragement. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner, even though they had not done anything wrong. Coach Ortiz reminded the robotics team that our competition season was still moving forward and encouraged everyone to focus on the work that had brought us together in the first place. Life was trying to return to normal, but it was obvious that something larger had started. Several weeks later, after the department released its preliminary findings, the school auditorium hosted a community forum that had originally been scheduled to discuss campus safety. After the incident, attendance doubled. Parents, teachers, students, school board members, and representatives from the police department filled nearly every seat. The atmosphere remained respectful, but everyone understood why they were there. The police chief opened the meeting by acknowledging that trust had been shaken and promised a transparent review. He reminded the audience that accountability required both evidence and patience. Then he invited community members to speak. Several parents described how quickly misunderstandings can grow when assumptions replace communication. Teachers discussed the importance of treating every student with dignity, especially during stressful situations. Coach Ortiz explained how proud he was that his students had remained calm throughout the encounter. Halfway through the meeting, one comment changed the direction of the discussion. A veteran police sergeant stood and addressed the audience. "Many people believe silence keeps organizations strong," he said. "Sometimes silence does exactly the opposite." The room became noticeably quieter. He continued, "If officers see concerning behavior and choose not to report it because it feels uncomfortable, then small problems have a way of becoming much larger ones." Several officers seated together looked down thoughtfully. It was not an accusation. It sounded more like a difficult truth that many people already understood. The discussion gradually shifted away from one individual and toward the systems that either encourage accountability or unintentionally discourage it. My mother was invited to speak next. She walked to the podium without notes. "I am not here because I want special treatment for my son," she began. "I am here because every family deserves confidence that facts will matter more than assumptions." She paused briefly before continuing. "Strong institutions are not defined by whether mistakes happen. They are defined by what they do after those mistakes are discovered." Nobody interrupted her. Even those who disagreed with individual opinions listened carefully because her words focused on improvement rather than blame. When she finished, the audience responded with quiet applause instead of loud celebration. As the meeting appeared to be winding down, the police chief glanced toward the back of the auditorium, where Officer Terry Simmons had quietly entered without attracting attention. The chief spoke only one sentence. "Now that the preliminary findings have been released and the relevant interviews have been completed, Officer Simmons has requested an opportunity to address this community personally." Every conversation stopped as Simmons slowly stood up, walked toward the podium, and placed a folded sheet of paper on the lectern before looking directly at the audience for the first time. Officer Terry Simmons stood behind the podium for several long seconds without touching the microphone. The folded sheet of paper remained in front of him, but instead of reading from it, he looked slowly across the auditorium at the students, parents, teachers, fellow officers, and community members who had gathered. When he finally spoke, his voice was noticeably steadier than many people expected. "I prepared a statement," he said, placing one hand on the paper. "But after listening tonight, I do not believe reading it would accomplish much." He folded the paper once more and slipped it into his pocket. The room remained completely silent. "Over the past several weeks," he continued, "I have reviewed the body camera footage, the school security recordings, and my own report more times than I care to admit. I kept looking for the moment where everything changed." He paused briefly. "Eventually I realized something difficult. The moment that mattered happened before any camera recorded anything. It happened inside my own assumptions." Several audience members exchanged quiet glances. Simmons continued without attempting to defend himself. "When I saw Malik carrying that equipment case, I believed I was making quick decisions based on experience. Looking back now, I can see that I reached conclusions before I gathered enough facts. Once I convinced myself that my first impression was correct, every ordinary detail seemed to support it." He looked toward me for the first time since walking onto the stage. "That was my responsibility, and I failed to meet it." Nobody applauded. Nobody interrupted. The silence carried more weight than any reaction could have. Then Simmons added something that surprised even the officers seated behind him. Officer Pender questioned whether we had enough information. Other people offered explanations. I heard the words, but I did not truly listen to them. That is something I will have to live with. Pender lowered his eyes briefly before looking back toward the podium. The honesty in the room had become almost uncomfortable because it was so unexpected. Then the police chief quietly stepped closer to the stage but stopped without speaking, allowing Simmons to continue. Simmons took a slow breath. I do not expect forgiveness because I admitted my mistake. Accountability is not something you receive simply because you apologize. It has to be earned over time. Several parents nodded almost imperceptibly. The conversation had shifted far beyond one afternoon outside a school. It had become a discussion about judgment, responsibility, and trust. A few moments later, the moderator invited me to speak if I felt comfortable doing so. I had not planned to say anything, but after looking at my mother, I stood and walked toward the podium. Standing in front of hundreds of people felt strangely similar to presenting at the robotics competition only days earlier, except this time there were no judges, no trophies, and no prepared speech. People have asked me whether I am angry, I began. The truth is that I was confused before I was angry. I kept wondering what I had done wrong. Then I realized that sometimes a person can do everything right and still end up having to prove they belong. I looked around the auditorium before continuing. What matters now is making sure the next student never has to ask that same question. The audience remained quiet for another moment before offering gentle applause. It was not loud or celebratory. It sounded more like appreciation for honesty than agreement with every opinion expressed that evening. As the applause faded, my mother stood from her seat holding a small manila envelope that none of us had noticed earlier. She walked calmly toward the stage and said, "There is one more piece of this story that I have carried with me for many years. Until tonight, I never realized it belonged to everyone in this room." She carefully opened the envelope, revealing a yellowed newspaper clipping that immediately caught Officer Simmons's attention, and the expression on his face changed before she had spoken a single word about what it contained. My mother carefully unfolded the yellowed newspaper clipping and placed it on the podium where Officer Simmons could see it. The paper had faded with time, but one photograph remained remarkably clear. It showed firefighters standing outside a burning apartment building nearly 25 years earlier. One firefighter was carrying a young black woman wrapped in a blanket. Beneath the photograph, the caption identified him as Captain Keelan Simmons. Officer Terry Simmons stared at the article without speaking. My mother gently turned toward the audience. Many years before I became an investigator, before I became Malik's mother, and before Terry became a police officer, I was a college student living in that apartment building. Captain Keelan Simmons was one of the firefighters who carried me to safety. The room became perfectly still. Terry looked back at the photograph, then quietly whispered, "My father." My mother nodded. He never asked who I was. He never asked where I came from. He never treated me as a stranger. He simply saw someone who needed help. Terry lowered his head. "I never knew. I did not know you were his son either," my mother replied. "I recognized the last name on your uniform, but I did not make the connection until I later confirmed that Captain Keelan Simmons was your father." She paused before continuing. "I spent several days wondering whether I should tell this story. Eventually I realized it was not about the past. It was about the choices we make today." Terry remained silent for several moments before speaking into the microphone once more. "My father taught me that character is revealed by how we treat people we have never met. Somewhere along the way, I stopped living up to that lesson." Nobody rushed to respond. His words stood on their own. During the weeks that followed, the department completed its administrative review. The findings confirmed that racial bias and unsupported assumptions had influenced the decision to prolong the encounter even after multiple witnesses and school records had verified Malik's explanation. The review also found that established investigative procedures had not been followed. The department also acknowledged that an earlier recommendation for additional training had never been completed because of an internal administrative oversight. New policies were introduced requiring earlier intervention when patterns of concern appeared, along with expanded training focused on communication, decision-making, and recognizing unconscious bias. Officer Pender later volunteered to help develop scenario-based training that encouraged officers to question their own assumptions before drawing conclusions. He also acknowledged that recognizing a problem was not enough if he remained silent while the encounter continued, and that failing to challenge Simmons's assumptions had allowed the situation to escalate. Terry Simmons accepted the department's decisions without public complaint and entered the required improvement programs. Over time, he also chose to participate in community meetings where residents and officers could speak honestly with one another. My mother never described those changes as a victory. She simply said that meaningful progress usually begins with people who are willing to examine difficult truths instead of avoiding them. As for me, I received the engineering scholarship that had first brought me to the robotics competition that afternoon. A year later, I left for college with the same gray equipment case that had unexpectedly become part of a much larger story. I kept one item inside it that had nothing to do with robotics. It was a copy of that old newspaper clipping, not because it reminded me of the hardest day of my senior year, but because it reminded me that one person's example can echo across generations in ways nobody could possibly predict. Closing reflection. Perhaps the most lasting moments in life are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary decisions that reveal who we are when nobody expects to be watching. This story reminds us that racial assumptions can take hold in seconds, while understanding requires the patience to stop, listen, and examine the facts. Fairness does not depend on institutions never making mistakes. It depends on whether people are willing to recognize those mistakes, name the bias that helped create them, and correct the systems that allowed them to continue. Malik should have been treated fairly long before anyone learned who his mother was. His explanation should have mattered from the beginning. Perhaps that is the lesson worth carrying forward. Dignity should never depend on who someone knows, what position their parent holds, or how many cameras happen to be recording. It should be given before assumptions are made, not restored only after the truth becomes impossible to ignore.